Hi everyone, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 9 in your textbook. Please read Chapter 9 very carefully. There's a lot of information I don't have time to address. Okay, let's talk about ways to manage conflicts within your small group. Our case study revolves around a restaurant serving crew and their semi-annual shift selection meeting. After a few rounds of shift selection, the senior server realized that a turn had accidentally been skipped, and servers with little seniority had actually ended up getting pretty good shifts because those with more seniority had been passed over. He pointed it out, and the servers discussed whether or not to start over. Of course, the servers with good shifts didn't want to do that, but eventually they did decide to restart the process. The less senior servers started ending up with shifts they didn't want, and there was more discussion, complaining, and defensiveness. A few servers stayed neutral because they didn't want to get involved in the argument, but it affected them as well anyway. Although some people actually like conflict, most of us don't, and this is why. We see the anger, the frustration, the hard feelings, and tension that can result from it. But in a small group, there is bound to be some conflict of some sort. Maybe not this intense, but it will still exist. So you need to understand what it is, why it occurs, and most importantly, that not only is it inevitable and natural, but that there are several very effective ways to deal with it. Conflict occurs when discordant ideas or feelings are expressed or experienced between at least two interdependent parties. Because we are all different, we don't see things in exactly the same way as someone else. Remember, primary and secondary tensions are part of the group's evolution. Primary tensions usually subside as the group members become acquainted, but secondary tensions will naturally arise. It's all in understanding and managing it. Let's look at some of the myths surrounding conflict and the realities of it. Myth 1 says that conflict is harmful and should be avoided. Certainly when we observe or are in the middle of conflict, it feels that way, and it can certainly cause harm if it gets out of control. But conflict that is expressed and managed properly can actually help groups to see an issue more clearly because they can see all sides of it, and that can help improve their decisions, increase member involvement, and when conflict is resolved or managed well, can increase the group's cohesiveness. Myth 2 says that conflict represents a misunderstanding, which is entirely the case sometimes if you think someone said one thing when they actually said or at least meant something else entirely. But conflict can occur for other reasons. Many conflicts occur over differences in values, opinions, goals, or resources. The book gives an excellent example of why the debate over abortion is so difficult. It's because people have different ideas about its value and what is more important. They don't necessarily misunderstand the other position, they just don't agree with it. Managing conflict well requires an understanding of why the conflict is occurring. Just assuming that it's because people aren't communicating effectively may not get to the heart of the disagreement. Myth 3 says that all conflicts can be resolved if the parties are willing to discuss the issues. Well, as I just said about the abortion debate, that's obviously not the case. People have been discussing, arguing, fighting, and sometimes killing each other over this issue for many years. But it's an issue of value, and things like that may never be resolved. If the argument is over resources like oil or water rights, then even though every party might have a very good justification for why their claim is better, and the other parties understand that, they may still believe their reasons and needs outweigh others. Simply discussing issues does not mean they will be resolved. It can certainly happen, but as the textbook says, it's better to understand how to successfully manage conflict than to expect to resolve it. There are basically three types of group conflict: task, relational, and process. Sometimes all three of these things can come into play, as it did in the cask and cleaver example. They got into conflict over the process or procedure, then about the task itself, the actual shifts and the justification for the servers wanting what they wanted, and then relational conflict where they started making it personal and forming coalitions. One thing to remember about conflict is that it is neither good nor bad. What does matter is what it's about, how it's initiated, and how it's managed. Let's look at these three different types. Task conflict results from disagreements that arise from the task itself. For instance, if you're talking about potential solutions for your problem-solving panel discussion, and you think one solution is the best one, and someone else thinks that one will never work, but this other one will work great, that's task conflict. As long as all parties are open to looking at the pros and cons of both solutions, good evidence is presented, both are discussed, and everyone's willing to come to a conclusion, this conflict may be resolved. But if people dig in their heels and refuse to budge, possibly based on their values and opinions, it might be harder. Relational conflict erupts when personalities clash. It can arise from task or procedural conflict, but it's not related to the task itself. It's when feelings come into play. One person feels like someone has more power, is treating them poorly, or doesn't seem to care about them or their feelings. The Cask and Cleaver crew definitely exhibited this when they restarted the shift selection and things were working out much better for some people than others. Resentment came into play. Finally, procedural conflict or process conflict has to do with disagreements over how the task is accomplished, including how time in groups is spent, who does what, coordinating member responsibilities and workloads. If someone thinks time isn't being used in groups effectively, or that they've been given more work than somebody else, those are the kinds of things that can lead to procedural conflict. Procedural conflict also contains elements of task and relational conflict in it. Conflicts can quickly become personal if individuals feel as if they are being treated unfairly. So conflict is a natural outgrowth of group process. But what do we do about it? If we don't handle it effectively, it can hurt the group and its members, both interpersonally and in their work towards the goal. Fortunately, there are lots of good ways to handle conflict. Unfortunately, individuals have a tendency to only rely on one way to handle conflict, and that's where the problems arise. According to behavioral scientist Kenneth Thomas, there are 5 basic styles of conflict management: avoidance, accommodation, competition, compromise, and collaboration. Most of us tend to rely on only one of these styles when conflict arises, possibly because of our general personality type, but also possibly because of the culture in which we were raised. Most people are surprised to find out there are different ways to respond to conflict, and it tends to get them to look at it differently once they understand that. In the module, there's a link to a conflict resolution style quiz. Please make sure you take it so that you know what your basic style is. Before we look closely at the 5 basic styles, I want you to understand where they come from. Approaches to conflict can be summarized by answering 2 questions. Number 1, how important is it to satisfy your own needs? Versus number 2, how important is it to satisfy the other person's needs? Now, I'm not speaking in general. I'm talking about as it relates to any given conflict. Let's take an example. Say your 12-year-old daughter wants to go to a school dance, but you think she's too young and are afraid for her safety. What are your needs in this situation? What are her needs? Are yours more important? Are hers? Are they both important? Okay, now let's look at the 5 styles as it relates to this situation. The 5 conflict management styles correspond to your motivation to meet your own needs versus your motivation to meet your daughter's needs. If you think that both your needs and her needs are of low importance and you just don't want to get into it with her, you might try the avoidance style, which describes a person's unwillingness to confront or engage in conflict. So you might say, I don't care, do whatever you want, it doesn't matter to me. If you think that her need for friendship, fun, establishing her place on the social ladder, and getting out of the house are more important than any misgivings you might have about it, then you might try the accommodation style, which describes a person's willingness to engage in conflict. However, they back away from the conflict by giving in to appease the other party. So you might say, well, I am concerned about you going, but I can see that you really want to, so okay. At the other end of the scale, you might think that your duty as a parent and your fear for her safety and the fact that you have the power in this relationship and in the situation overrides any of her needs. Then you would use the competition style where you want to come out ahead at the expense of the other party. So you'd say something like, absolutely not, you're too young, you're not going, end of story. This is a win-lose situation. You win, she loses. If you think your needs are highly important, but you also think that your daughter's needs are important as well, maybe you can use the compromise style, in which nobody gets exactly what they want, but everyone gets something. Maybe you say, okay, you can go to the dance, but I'm driving you and I'm picking you up and you can only stay till 9 p.m. You've both given up something to get at least part of what you want. The fifth style, collaboration, shows a preference for working with the other person to find a solution that pleases both parties. Maybe she promises to FaceTime you when she gets there and once again at 8 p.m. and asks if it's okay if her friend's mom takes them and then you pick them up at 10. And after some discussion, you decide that that's a good plan. Everyone's happy, your needs are taken care of, or at least alleviated somewhat, and your daughter gets to go to the dance. Now, you might have thought of what your typical reaction would be in this situation, and you also might think that that's the right one and maybe the only one. And it's true that some of these are better than others in this particular situation. But if you think there's only one way to handle it, it kind of just makes you inflexible, which isn't a good trait to have if you want to get along in a small group. But at least now you know that there's more than one way to handle conflict. Each of the 5 styles we talked about have a time and a place in which they're appropriate. There isn't necessarily one conflict management style that always works. If it truly doesn't matter who wins, then avoidance or accommodation is the thing to do. If you feel so strongly that you're correct, and the other side's ideas might actually be harmful or absolutely won't work, then maybe you should use the competition style and fight to get your way. But if everyone has a point and there are good arguments on both sides, then integrative approaches like collaboration or compromise is definitely the way to go. The tendency we have to always use the same conflict resolution style can lead to even more conflict and distress when it doesn't work. If you are a highly competitive person, for instance, and for every conflict you face, your whole motivation is to win, trust me when I say you're going to find it very difficult to get along in your group. If, because of your personality or your culture, you find the very nature of conflict abhorrent and avoid it at all costs, or always give in just to get along, then your ideas and needs will never be fully satisfied, and you're not going to have a very good time in the group. Effective group norms can be a way to manage the different conflict styles in your group, but norms must also be seen as appropriate as well. If your group always does something in a certain way, is that because it's effective and appropriate, or because you just started doing that way and people are afraid to bring up that it might get the job done, but at the cost of someone's feelings? Something to think about. Another way to manage conflict is to remember to express disagreement in an ethical manner. How you express it is as important as what you're expressing. You might have an absolutely valid point, but if you say it in a snide and condescending way, it's not going to benefit the group, and people are more likely to become defensive and reject your idea, even if it's a good one. Here are some suggestions about the best way to express disagreement. First, if it's that important, make sure that you express it. Failure to express disagreement may deprive the group of important ideas and reasoning. Second, do it in a timely way. Don't wait until it's too late, the decision's already been made, or there's no time to do anything about it. Third, express your disagreement in a constructive manner. Disagree with ideas, not with people. Don't use emotionally charged language, particularly insults. Be neutral, but descriptive. Give reasons that make sense. Finally, react in the spirit of inquiry rather than defensiveness. Ask for feedback and criticism of your ideas. Listen actively and with interest, and be willing to explain yourself in more detail as necessary. The way you communicate in the group can maximize your chances of having your ideas heard and influencing the group. You also need to make sure your arguments are of high quality. If it's an important idea and you want it heard, you should have thought it through, maybe done some research on it to find evidence that supports your idea, and understand and be able to respond to criticism of that idea well. Stick to a consistent message. Don't flip-flop. The book talks about being a member of a subgroup in your group. That's 2 or 3 people working together on part of the project. If you end up on a subgroup, make sure that you and your subgroup members all agree on the ideas you're presenting to the group as a whole. You need to form a united front. One of the ways in which groups are superior in problem solving compared to individuals is the obvious 2 heads are better than 1. But putting that advantage to work and avoiding or ameliorating conflict can be difficult. The nominal group technique is a useful process for groups dealing with controversy and tends to have generally positive results. The steps are: the problem is stated clearly. Discrepancies between what is desired and what currently exists are explained without actually stating at this point any possible solutions. Then participants are asked to generate a list of characteristics or features of the problem. Then each person works by themselves silently for a period of time to come up with potential ways to fix the problem. Once the time is up, members each say their suggestion in round-robin fashion while someone writes them on a chart. Then members clarify or give more information about each suggestion without criticizing or disagreeing with it. Each person then chooses their top-ranked item. At that point, they engage in discussion about those items through critical thinking, reasoning, logic, and thorough analysis. Another good technique to use, especially when the disagreement might devolve into a relational one where people are clinging defiantly to their ideas and feelings get hurt, is to use principled negotiation. This technique allows group members to be heard in ways that don't damage relationships. First, separate the people from the problem. What starts out as a disagreement about how to do something can devolve into a personal declaration of war where the combatants try to emotionally hurt each other. The problem, the real issue, needs to be separated from the emotional component and clearly stated. Second, focus on interests, not positions. People tend to stake out positions and refuse to budge, but that won't help come to a good decision. Focus on the interests of the people involved. What are they trying to gain? Is their reasoning for this position solid? What are their priorities? Do these interests fit in with the interests of the group? What does the group need that will help it move forward? Third, invent new options for mutual gain. Is there another different way to solve the problem that will serve everyone's interests? In the cask and cleaver example, here's what they realized after some discussion, that instead of going back and starting entirely over with the shift selection, they could have simply gone back to the point where the error occurred and started again from there. That's not what they did, but once they saw that there were other options, they stopped being so stubborn and began to feel more empathy for those who really needed shifts they hadn't gotten. And in the end, people actually traded shifts with each other willingly to make everything work. Finally, insist on using objective criteria. Members should agree on judging the best solution on objective criteria, not emotional or subjective. Solutions should be fair and equitable. The cask and cleaver crew members collaborated and compromised to get the shifts covered in the best way for the restaurant. I hope you can see that conflict, while often uncomfortable, is necessary to the growth of your group. There are lots of ways to handle it, and if it's managed effectively, it can result in better decisions and a more committed and cohesive group. This is the end of the lecture on Chapter 9.